The sun was setting over the lake, casting a golden glow across the water. The gentle lapping of the waves against the shore was the only sound that broke the silence. I sat on the old wooden dock, my feet dangling just above the water, staring out at the horizon. This place, my grandmother's lake house, had always been my sanctuary, but tonight it felt different. The peace I usually found here was replaced with a gnawing sense of unease. I had just returned from a long day at work when my phone buzzed with a text from my father. It was short and to the point. "Family dinner tonight. Be there." No explanation, no pleasantries. Just a command. I sighed, knowing better than to argue. My father wasn't the type to take no for an answer. As I drove to his house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My father had been acting strangely for weeks, ever since he married her. Sophia. She was beautiful, yes, but there was something about her that set my teeth on edge. Maybe it was the way she always seemed to be calculating, her eyes darting around like she was constantly assessing the value of everything and everyone in the room. When I arrived, the house was filled with the smell of roasted chicken and garlic bread. My father was at the head of the table, his usual stern expression softened by a glass of red wine. Sophia sat to his right, her perfectly manicured hands resting delicately on the tablecloth. She smiled at me as I walked in, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Emma," my father said, gesturing to the empty seat across from him. "Sit down. We have something to discuss." I hesitated, my stomach twisting into knots. This wasn't going to be a casual family dinner. I could feel it in the air, the tension, the unspoken words hanging heavy between us. I sat down, my hands gripping the edge of the table as I waited for the other shoe to drop. "Emma," my father began, his voice steady, but with an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite place. "Sophia and I have been talking, and we've made a decision about the lake house." My heart skipped a beat. The lake house. My grandmother's lake house. The one she left to me in her will. The one that had been in our family for generations. The one that held every memory of my childhood summers, of lazy days spent swimming in the lake, of nights spent stargazing on the dock, of mornings spent helping my grandmother tend to her beloved garden. "What about it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My father took a deep breath, his eyes meeting mine for the first time that evening. "We decided to transfer the property to Sophia. She's always loved it, and we think it would be the perfect summer home for her." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Transfer the property? To Sophia? This couldn't be happening. This wasn't happening. "Dad," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "That lake house is mine. Grandma left it to me. You can't just give it away." Sophia's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, Emma," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Your father has power of attorney. He's already handled the transfer. It's done." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Done? Just like that? My grandmother's final gift to me, the one thing she wanted me to have, was being handed over to this woman who had no connection to our family, no understanding of what this place meant. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. "No," I said, my voice firm despite the tears welling up in my eyes. "No, it's not done. You can't do this." My father's expression hardened. "Emma, sit down. This isn't up for discussion." But I wasn't going to sit down. I wasn't going to let this happen. Not without a fight. "You're wrong," I said, my voice steady now. "You're wrong, and you're going to regret this." I turned and walked out of the house, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let them take the lake house from me. Not without a fight. The next morning, I woke up early, my mind racing with plans and possibilities. I needed to act fast. I couldn't let my father and Sophia get away with this. I grabbed my phone and dialed the number of my grandmother's lawyer, Mr. Thompson. He had been her trusted advisor for decades, and if anyone could help me, it was him. "Mr. Thompson," I said as soon as he answered. "It's Emma. I need your help." I explained the situation, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and desperation. Mr. Thompson listened quietly, his occasional hums and murmurs the only indication that he was still on the line. When I finished, there was a long pause before he spoke. "Emma," he said, his voice calm and measured. "Your grandmother was a very wise woman. She knew your father better than anyone, and she took steps to protect the lake house, and you from exactly this kind of situation." I felt a glimmer of hope. "What do you mean?" "Your grandmother set up an irrevocable trust," he explained. "The lake house is protected. Any attempt to transfer ownership without proper authorization will trigger immediate legal consequences." I let out a breath. I didn't realize I'd been holding. "So, they can't just give it to Sophia?" "No," Mr. Thompson said firmly. "They can't. And if they've already tried, they're in for a very unpleasant surprise." I felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That evening, I returned to my father's house, this time with a folder full of documents from Mr. Thompson. My father and Sophia were in the living room, their heads close together as they whispered furiously. They looked up as I walked in, their expressions a mix of surprise and irritation. "Emma," my father said, his voice tight. "What are you doing here?" I didn't answer. Instead, I placed the folder on the coffee table and opened it, spreading the documents out for them to see. "What's this?" Sophia asked, her voice sharp. "This," I said, my voice calm but firm, "is proof that you can't take the lake house from me. It's in an irrevocable trust. Any attempt to transfer ownership without proper authorization will result in legal action." My father's face paled as he scanned the documents. This can't be right," he stammered. "I handled the transfer myself. I have power of attorney." "Did you?" I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Because according to these documents, you don't have the authority to transfer the property. And if you've already tried, you're in violation of the trust." Sophia's face contorted with rage. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "James, tell her this is ridiculous." But my father was silent, his eyes fixed on the documents in front of him. He looked like a man who had just realized he'd made a terrible mistake. "You can't do this," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "I'm your father. This was my mother's house. And she left it to me," I replied, my voice steady. "For a reason. Did you really think she wouldn't protect it?" Sophia stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You ungrateful little—" I cut her off. "The trust has very specific provisions about harassment or interference. Mr. Thompson is quite thorough in his documentation." The silence that followed was deafening. My father looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes, while Sophia's perfect composure had cracked completely. "The renovation plans," she whispered, more to herself than to us. "The contractors are starting next week." I took a sip of my water, letting the moment stretch. "You'll need to cancel those. Any modifications to the property require written authorization from the trust administrator." That would be me. My father started to speak, probably to try another angle of attack, but I held up my hand. "There's more. The trust includes detailed records of every attempt to access or transfer the property over the past 6 months, including some interesting conversations with real estate agents about potential buyers." That got their attention. Sophia's face went from angry red to pale white in seconds, while my father seemed to sink further into his chair. "You've been trying to sell it," I said, though I already knew the answer. Mr. Thompson's investigation had been thorough, even before this supposed transfer to Sophia. "That's interesting," I continued, "considering you knew Grandma left it to me specifically because you wanted it to stay in the family." "We were just exploring options." Sophia tried to backpedal, but her voice lacked conviction. "For the future. You know, property values in that area are rising." I finished for her. "Yes, I know. That's why the trust includes a provision preventing any sale without unanimous agreement from all beneficiaries. And since I'm the only beneficiary, the implications hung in the air. Not only had their attempt to transfer the property failed, but their broader plans to sell it for a profit were now impossible." My father finally found his voice. "You don't understand, Emma. Sophia and we have plans. The sale would have given us the capital to fund another of Sophia's business ventures, like the boutique that mysteriously closed after 6 months. Or maybe the yoga studio that never actually opened. Sophia's face flushed with anger. How dare you, James? Are you going to let her talk to me like this? But my father was still staring at the trust documents, reality finally sinking in. He'd lost, not just the lake house, but the potential windfall they'd been counting on. I stood up, gathering my things. The trust administrator, that's me, will be conducting a property inspection next weekend. I'll need you to remove any personal items you've left there. After that, the security codes will be changed. You can't just, Sophia started, but I cut her off. I can. And I will. Grandma made sure of that. She saw this coming, you know. She told Mr. Thompson that my father would try something like this eventually. That's why she set up the trust the way she did. I walked to the door, then turned back for one final point. Oh, and Dad? You might want to check your email. Mr. Thompson sent over some interesting documentation about your use of power of attorney. He thinks there might be some irregularities worth discussing. The look on their faces as I left was something I'd remember for a long time. But this wasn't about revenge. It was about protecting what was mine, what my grandmother had entrusted to me. As I drove home that evening, I thought about all the summers spent at that lake house, helping my grandmother tend her garden, listening to her stories. She taught me more than just how to care for plants. She taught me how to stand up for myself, how to protect what mattered. Sometimes, Emma, she told me once as we sat on the dock watching the sunset, the best defense is being prepared. People will always try to take what isn't theirs, but they can only succeed if you let them. She'd been right as usual. And now, thanks to her foresight, the lake house would stay exactly where it belonged, in the hands of someone who truly appreciated its value. The fallout from the dinner revelation was swift and explosive. The next morning, my phone was flooded with messages, angry texts from Sophia, pleading voicemails from my father, and even a few confused inquiries from family friends who had apparently been promised use of the lake house for their summer vacations. I forwarded each message to Mr. Thompson, adding to his already substantial documentation of their behavior. They're getting desperate, he noted during our morning call. Your father just tried to schedule an emergency meeting with me. Claimed there must be some mistake in the trust documents. Was there? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Your grandmother didn't make mistakes, Emma, Mr. Thompson said firmly. Especially not when it came to protecting what mattered to her. Later that afternoon, I drove out to the lake house, needing to see for myself what changes they had already made. As I pulled up the familiar gravel driveway, my heart sank. The garden my grandmother had lovingly tended for decades was partially dug up, presumably in preparation for Sophia's planned modernization. Construction materials were piled near the dock, and a large dumpster sat filled with what looked like original fixtures from the house. I was taking pictures of the damage when a car pulled up the driveway. Sophia stepped out, looking less polished than usual, and in her hurry to confront me. You have no right to be here, she snapped, striding toward me in her impractical heels. James and I have already paid deposits to the contractors. We have plans. I lowered my phone, making sure the photos were safely backed up to the cloud. Actually, you're the one who has no right to be here. As of this morning, the security company has been instructed to treat any unauthorized entry as trespassing. Trespassing? She laughed, but there was an edge of hysteria to it. I'm James's wife. This is our summer home. No, I said firmly. It's my property, held in a trust established by my grandmother. And those contractors you hired? They've all been notified that any work performed without proper authorization will result in legal action. Sophia's face contorted with rage. You think you're so clever, don't you? But you have no idea what you're doing. James and I had buyers lined up, wealthy buyers. This could have set us all up for life. Set you up, you mean? I corrected her. Just like you thought marrying my father would set you up. How's that working out for you? She took a step toward me, her finger pointed accusingly. Everything was fine until you interfered. We have plans for this place. Plans that would have benefited everyone. Everyone except me, I said calmly. And everyone except my grandmother, who wanted this place preserved, not torn down and commercialized. Your grandmother is dead, Sophia spat. And you're living in the past, clinging to this old house like it's some kind of shrine. The words hit hard, but I kept my composure. You're right about one thing. I am preserving this place.
But not just because of the past.
Because of what it represents, what it can still be. Just then, another car pulled up. My father's. He got out slowly, looking older and more defeated than I'd ever seen him. Sophia, he called out, his voice weary. I told you not to come here. Mr. Thompson just finished explaining everything to me. The trust is ironclad. Sophia whirled on him. You said you could handle this. You said the power of attorney. I was wrong, he cut her off. And for the first time, I heard real regret in his voice. About a lot of things. I watched their exchange with a strange sense of detachment. This was the moment my father had to choose, between his new wife's schemes and his daughter's inheritance, between quick profit and lasting legacy. The contractors, Sophia pressed. The deposits. We'll have to forfeit them, my father finished. We had no right to authorize those changes. The trust makes that very clear. Sophia's face went through a series of emotions: anger, disbelief, calculation, and finally, a cold sort of fury. Without another word, she stormed back to her car and peeled out of the driveway, leaving my father and me standing in the aftermath of her dust. I'm sorry, he said finally, looking at the half-destroyed garden. Your grandmother, she loved this place so much. She did, I agreed. And she trusted me to protect it. Not just the house, Dad, but everything it stands for, the memories, the history, the future she imagined for it. He nodded slowly. I forgot that somewhere along the way. Got caught up in Sophia's vision of luxury renovations and profitable flips. Your mother would have been so disappointed in me. The mention of my mother, gone now for 5 years, hung heavy in the air between us. She had loved this place too, had supported my grandmother's decision to leave it to me. It's not too late, I said finally. The garden can be replanted. The fixtures in that dumpster can be salvaged. It'll take work, but it's worth saving. Just like your grandmother always said, he finished. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw past the mistakes and poor choices to the father I remembered from my childhood. The one who used to help me build sandcastles on the lake's beach, who taught me to fish off the old dock. You're welcome to help, I offered. With the restoration. If you want to. His eyes met mine, hopeful but hesitant. Even after everything? The trust exists to protect the property, I said carefully. But it doesn't have to keep out family. Real family, Dad. People who understand what this place means. He looked around at the garden, the house, the lake sparkling beyond. Sophia won't like that. Sophia has a choice to make, I replied. Just like you did. In that moment, standing amid the wreckage of my grandmother's garden, I realized that sometimes saving a place means more than just protecting its legal ownership. Sometimes it means giving people a chance to remember what really matters, to choose legacy over profit, family over fast money. My father picked up a discarded garden tool. Where should we start? I smiled, thinking of all the summers spent working alongside my grandmother in this very garden. She always said the best place to start is wherever you're standing. Together, we began the work of restoration not just of the garden, but perhaps of something more fundamental. It wouldn't be easy. Sophia's influence still hung over my father like a shadow, and trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. But as we worked, I could almost hear my grandmother's voice on the breeze. Sometimes, Emma, she told me once, the greatest victories aren't in winning the fight, but in what you choose to build afterward. Over the next few weeks, the true scope of Sophia and my father's planned changes to the lake house became painfully clear. While sorting through paperwork in my father's home office, I discovered architectural plans that would have completely transformed the property, turning the charming, historic lake house into a modern luxury retreat with room for 50 guests. The contractor's invoices told an even more disturbing story. They'd been hired to begin work without permits, rushing to make changes before anyone could object. The more I dug, the more evidence I found of Sophia's influence, each modification designed to maximize profit potential with no regard for the property's history or meaning. One evening, as I was reviewing the documents with Mr. Thompson via video call, my father knocked on my door. He looked uncomfortable, clutching a manila envelope. "There's something else you need to see," he said, placing the envelope on my desk. Inside were marketing materials for Lake Sophia Resort and Spa, complete with renderings showing my grandmother's beloved home transformed into something unrecognizable. The garden would have become a parking lot, the old dock replaced by a modern marina. She had investors lined up, my father admitted, his voice heavy with shame. That's why she was so confident about the transfer. They were ready to begin construction as soon as the property changed hands. I felt physically ill looking at the glossy brochures. "And you agreed to this?" He sat down heavily in the chair across from me. She made it sound so reasonable. Said we were foolish to let such valuable property sit unused most of the year. I called it unlocking its potential. Unused? I couldn't keep the edge from my voice. "Dad, I use this house. I maintain it. I share it with family and friends. Just because we're not charging $500 a night doesn't mean it's going to waste." Before he could respond, my phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. "Your precious lake house won't stay yours forever. Everyone has a price." I showed the message to my father. His face fell further. "She's been like this since you revealed the trust," he said. Angry. Calculating. "This isn't the woman I married." "Or maybe it is," I suggested gently. "Maybe this is exactly who she's always been, and you're just finally seeing it." The next day, Mr. Thompson called with news that confirmed my suspicions. His investigation had uncovered a pattern of similar schemes in Sophia's past: failed resort developments, property flips that left investors high and dry, businesses that collapsed under suspicious circumstances. "She's done this before," he explained. "Finds wealthy older men, gains their trust, then uses their assets and connections for her real estate ventures. When things go south, she moves on." I thought about sharing this information with my father, but decided against it. He was already struggling with the reality of Sophia's true nature. Proof of her past deceptions might break him completely. Instead, I focused on healing what could be healed. The garden was slowly coming back to life, with my father spending weekends helping me replant what had been destroyed. We worked mostly in silence, but it was a comfortable one, filled with shared purpose. One Saturday morning, as we were clearing debris from the flower beds, Sophia made her final play. She arrived in a sleek black SUV, accompanied by two men in expensive suits. "These gentlemen represent my investors," she announced, striding across the lawn. "They're prepared to make you a very generous offer for the property." I straightened up, garden tools still in hand. "The property isn't for sale. At any price." The taller of the two men stepped forward, extending a business card. "Perhaps we could discuss this inside. Our offer might surprise you." "No," I said firmly. "The trust specifically prohibits any sale. It's not negotiable." Sophia's polished facade cracked. "You stupid, sentimental fool. Do you have any idea how much money you're throwing away, all for some old woman's garden?" My father, who had been quietly working nearby, finally spoke up. "That old woman was my mother, Sophia. And this garden, this house, they're her legacy. Not your next real estate flip." Sophia stared at him, clearly not expecting resistance from that quarter. "James, be reasonable. Think about our future." "I am," he replied, standing to face her. "And I'm starting to think our futures might be heading in different directions." The investors, sensing the shift in dynamics, began backing toward their car. Sophia watched them go, her carefully constructed plans crumbling before her eyes. "This isn't over," she hissed, but the threat sounded hollow. "Actually it is," I said, pulling out my phone. "Mr. Thompson has been quite thorough in documenting your history of real estate fraud. He's prepared to share his findings with the appropriate authorities if you continue to harass us." She left in a fury of squealing tires and thrown gravel, leaving my father and me standing in the partially restored garden. "I've been such a fool," he said after a long moment. "Not a fool," I corrected him. Just someone who wanted to believe in love again. There's nothing wrong with that. He looked around at the garden, at the evidence of our shared work. Your grandmother would be proud of you, you know. Not just for protecting the property, but for how you did it, with strength, but also with grace. I picked up my gardening tools, returning to the task at hand. She'd be proud of you too, Dad, for finding your way back. As we worked side by side in the late summer sunshine, I thought about everything that had happened. Sophia had tried to turn this place of memories and meaning into just another soulless resort. She had nearly succeeded, not through force, but through manipulation and false promises. But my grandmother had seen it coming. She'd known that the true value of the lake house wasn't in its potential sale price or development opportunities. It was in the generations of memories it held, and the ones yet to be made. What happens now? My father asked as we finished planting a row of my grandmother's favorite roses. I looked out over the lake, its surface golden in the evening light. Now we rebuild. Not just the garden, but everything else too. He nodded, understanding that I meant more than just the physical restoration of the property. Trust, like gardens, takes time and care to grow back strong. But standing there, surrounded by the evidence of new growth emerging from old roots, I knew we were on the right path. Sophia's grand plans for Lake Sophia Resort would remain nothing more than glossy renderings in a forgotten folder. The real lake house, my grandmother's lake house, would continue to be exactly what it was meant to be: a home, a haven, a place where family could heal and grow together. The weeks following Sophia's dramatic exit brought a strange, new rhythm to life at the lake house. What had started as my solitary mission to protect my grandmother's legacy had evolved into something unexpected, a chance for my father and me to rebuild, not just the property, but our relationship. Each morning, we'd arrive with coffee and work plans, tackling the restoration piece by piece. The garden came first, with my father surprising me by remembering many of my grandmother's planting preferences. She always put the lavender on the eastern edge, he'd say. Or, the hydrangeas need more shade than you might think. Small details that revealed he'd paid more attention than I'd given him credit for. Sophia, meanwhile, maintained her distance, but not her silence. Her lawyer sent increasingly desperate settlement offers, each one attempting to circumvent the trust's restrictions. She's running out of options, Mr. Thompson explained during one of our weekly update calls. The investors she promised this property to are demanding answers. And from what I can gather, she made some significant financial commitments based on her guaranteed acquisition of the lake house. Not my problem, I said, watching through the window as my father painstakingly restored the old dock, board by board. No, it's not, Mr. Thompson agreed. But you should be prepared for escalation. People like Sophia rarely accept defeat gracefully. He was right. A week later, Sophia made her final play, a direct appeal to my father that I witnessed through the kitchen window. They stood near the edge of the property, her gestures animated, her expression cycling between pleading and threatening. My father remained still, arms crossed, shaking his head repeatedly. When he finally returned to the house, his expression was grim but resolute. She wanted me to contest the trust, he said without preamble. Said if I claimed your grandmother wasn't of sound mind when she created it, we might have a chance to invalidate it. I felt a chill despite the summer warmth. And I told her it was over. He sat heavily at the kitchen table, the weight of his decision evident in every line of his face. I filed for divorce. The announcement hung in the air between us. This wasn't what I'd expected, or even what I'd wanted, when I first confronted them about the lake house. I'd simply wanted to protect my inheritance, not destroy my father's marriage. Dad, I began. I never meant. This isn't your fault, Olivia, he interrupted. Sophia and what we had wasn't real. Not on her side, anyway. I was just a means to an end, access to properties and connections she could exploit. Mr. Thompson found evidence of her past schemes. I admitted. I didn't tell you because I thought it would hurt too much. He nodded, unsurprised. I started doing my own research after that day with the investors. Found some of her previous husbands. Had some illuminating conversations. He attempted a smile. Turns out I'm not the first man to fall for her act. Just the latest. We sat in silence for a moment, the sound of the lake lapping against the shore filtering through the open windows. What now? I finally asked. Now, he said, looking around at the half-restored kitchen. We keep rebuilding. The house. And everything else. That evening, as the sun set over the lake, we sat on the newly repaired dock with glasses of my grandmother's favorite lemonade. The garden was coming back to life, with new shoots pushing through the soil where Sophia's contractors had torn up the old plants. The house itself was slowly returning to its former charm, the modern fixtures Sophia had installed replaced with pieces more in keeping with its history. Your grandmother once told me something I didn't understand at the time, my father said, watching the golden light dance across the water. She said that houses have souls, just like people, that they remember who loved them and who didn't. I smiled, hearing my grandmother's wisdom in his words. She used to tell me that too. Said that's why this place always felt so special, because generations of our family had filled it with love. I forgot that for a while, he admitted. Got caught up in Sophia's vision of potential and investment opportunity. Stopped seeing the soul of this place. But you see it now, I said, not as a question but as recognition. He nodded, his gaze taking in the familiar shoreline, the gardens beginning to bloom again, the weathered wood of the boathouse that had sheltered our family's small fleet of canoes and kayaks for decades. I see it, he agreed. And I'm grateful you fought to protect it, even when that meant fighting me. The sound of a car coming up the driveway interrupted our moment. Mr. Thompson stepped out, holding a folder. Good news, he called as he approached the dock. Sophia has officially withdrawn all claims against the property. The trust stands unchallenged. As Mr. Thompson explained the legal details, I found myself looking not at him, but at my father. The tension that had lived in his shoulders since this all began had finally eased. He looked more like the father I remembered from childhood, present, engaged, at peace. The lake house was safe, just as my grandmother had intended. But she had protected more than just property with her foresight. She had created the opportunity for healing, for truth, for reconciliation. In fighting to preserve her legacy, I'd unexpectedly recovered something I thought was lost forever, my father.